Hello, everyone. I'm Zach Nelson, Director of Health ISAC's Threat Operations Center, and your moderator for today's Health ISAC webinar, courtesy of our trusted navigator, Finite State. The title of today's webinar is Navigating the Complexity of IoT Device Vulnerability and the Future State of Medical Device Security. We will have a panel of subject matter experts discussing IoT devices. Specifically connected medical devices are considered low-hanging fruit for attackers. Today, we have the pleasure of having a wide variety of experts within the IoT field to include Tom Bain, who is the Executive Vice President of Marketing for Finite State. We also have Justin Heel, Director of Enterprise Risk Management for Baxter International Incorporated. We have Steve SBOM, Global Head of Manufacturer Alliances for Clarity. We also have Peter Fonesh, Chief Technology Officer for Option 3, and our very own Phil Englert, Director of Medical Device Security for Health ISAC. Before we get started, let me go through a few housekeeping notes. Again, this is a Health ISAC Navigator webinar. All attendees have been muted. This webinar will indeed be recorded for future use. If you do have any questions, we just ask that you go down to I think it's at the bottom, the banner, and go into the Q&A and ask those questions at any given time. And I will be monitoring that for the panel and will interject as needed, or we can save the questions to the end if deemed fit. So without further delay, I will hand the reins over to Tom Bain, Executive Vice President of Finite State, to get things started. Over to you, Tom.
Zach, thank you very much. Good to see you again. Good to see the entire panel today. We certainly have a lot of ground to cover, and I think we can probably just jump right in. Today, we're talking about medical device security, and we're talking about some of the trends that are impacting where this is currently for organizations, both on the device manufacturer side and those who are using the devices as well too in the field. We'll jump right in. I think at a high level, our first question is going to go to Phil Englert. So everybody here has been in the connected medical device industry / market in some respect. Today, what do you think is making medical devices such an attractive target for attackers? Where is that coming from? Why are we considering this low-hanging fruit? And what's driving the increase in that risk?
So there's a couple of things. One, right, is that these devices are built for specific clinical functionality, right? So there's rigidity in the technology, right? It is designed to perform its function predictably and reliably, and to do so in a wide variety of environments: hot, cold, wet, dry, all kinds of places, right? The design for clinical functionality also often limits the processing and power requirements needed to support cyber functions such as encryption or user authentication, right? The second is the lateral access that these devices have to the very data they create, which is the real target, right? Overwhelmingly, bad actors have sought to deny access to the data needed to deliver healthcare or leverage patient data exposure. Both of these factors are for the purpose of extortion. And really, that's the underlying crux of this, right? These devices were designed to perform clinical functionality with security, as an afterthought. That thought is evolving, right? The risks are not new. The risks have always been present. What is new is our awareness of them.
Interesting. And as we've been leading up to this panel and starting to dig into this topic substantially, I know that Peter, you've had some thoughts as well too. When you start to think about where that risk starts to come in, why we consider them low-hanging fruit. If we think through some of the elements around exposures, I think there's a lot of gaps there that you've started to kind of look at and articulate.
Yes, I think first of all, I want to echo Phil's comments, but a little more emphasis on the fact that I think ransomware attackers who are basically purely in for the money target medical devices, first of all, because they are vulnerable because of the points that Phil made. You can't point endpoint protection on a medical device, right? It just doesn't have the processing power to run that. And I think that they see that also that it's a critical function of the hospital, right? You can shut down the external web or access on a hospital, not much. Okay, some hospital patients aren't very happy, but they can work, right? You can even shut down the billing systems of the hospital for a time being, and they still can function. But if you shut down the medical devices, the operating rooms, things like that cannot function. So they're a great target. They're vulnerable, and they're also very much a great target because they are something that hospital needs and depends on, right? A hospital cannot function without the medical devices. And there's actually a standard that I wrote a paper on that 62304, ISO 62304, which actually classifies medical devices into 3 categories, right? One, no harm, some harm, potentially could cause death. Obviously, what you have to do is you have to worry about the ones that really could cause death as the ones you really have to protect. And my viewpoint of things is that you really should start thinking about segmenting, micro-segmentation of the network to protect these medical devices.
Yeah, and another area of concern and challenge just with the device industry is that the update and patch cycles of these devices based on the verification and validation that needs to be done to make sure that these devices are still safe and effective after these, that they're recoded. And then depending on how the devices are deployed, does that require hands-on to update and upgrade these devices? Or are we evolving to over-the-air updates so we can do this more efficiently and effectively? So it's the state of the devices and the time it takes to do this that also leaves them in a potentially vulnerable state.
I'd like to echo Justin's comment there. It's that lag time that can create that opportunity for attack. These devices can't be typically upgraded on the operating system or third-party apps that may comprise a broader solution without that going through a validation cycle by the manufacturer. And take that and multiply the number of years these devices tend to be used. They tend to be in market in some cases a lot longer than manufacturer would like, but you run into end of life of certain components of those systems, and in some cases operating systems that are left vulnerable. So it gets back to how do you protect that? Maybe the microsegmentation comment is one way to do so, but that lag time creates an opportunity for attackers.
Really interesting. And if you think through the points around disruption and lag time, disruption comes with, as Peter pointed out in the paper that he wrote, disruption comes with a couple of different layers of actual risk, right? Like if you're thinking through the impact of a medical device that is attacked, right, and it's no longer operable within a hospital setting, and it's impacting patient care to some extent, it almost would suggest the microsegmentation would be around that level of risk that particular device, set of devices, or sort of like segmented sort of categories of devices would take. How would you start to sort of apply that? Would it be an alignment into sort of like the risk appetite for both the device manufacturer and the HDO potentially?
So I'll try to answer that. So I'll start with it. First of all, I would go categorize it, in those 3 classes, in terms of, now I'd go and look at the devices that could cause death if they stop functioning, right? And so I would look to try to protect those. And the other thing that I want to bring up is it's not just protecting those, but even if you microsegment, there may be other devices in there. There are devices or computers, right, that are in that microsegmentation that may cause vulnerabilities to the actual medical device. So you got to start, I think you have to first start looking at microsegmentation, but then you have to start thinking about, all right, how do I make sure that everything that's in that microsegment is actually at the same level of security as my medical device? Because all I have to do, and SolarWinds is a great example, right? There was a trusted, I have access. So you want to make sure that, for example, your most trusted assets are very well in terms of supply chain, in terms of other ways of protecting those, that they, during the software development process, that they are very secure, and you know that they're very secure, and keep them in that micro segment with those medical devices, because those medical devices are very, very vulnerable. Now you could, if you want to, it's a trade-off between expense and things like that, and right, and network configuration. But you could, you could actually put monitors in there that monitors communications traffic, for example, within the micro segment with that medical device, and only allow accepted protocols and accepted known IP addresses to talk to those devices, right? As part of the segmentation protection. But there's multiple ways of protecting it, right? But I think what you have to do is you have to do that micro segmentation. You have to protect that whole micro segment, all of everything that's in there, not just the medical devices. And then you got to monitor it very, very carefully. So you got to do a lot of things, and you have to also go back to that supply chain and make sure that supply chain is really secure.
Right, and if I can jump in, because I agree that, with what Peter said, that patient safety is a paramount consideration, right? But we also have to look at healthcare delivery, right? If these devices fail to operate, how does that affect the ability, to deliver healthcare? How does that impact the operations of a hospital, of a clinic, of a surgery center, right? Do we inconvenience patients? Do we put our emergency room on divert and send, critical patients another 30 minutes in order to obtain care? Do we shut down operations? Do we close a NICU, where we've got highly susceptible patients, that can't really tolerate, inconsistencies in care delivery, right? So there are bigger questions to just the patient safety element. There's also the aspects of patient privacy and those risks as well. And as Peter indicated, this is a very complex, ecosystem, right? We have thousands of makes and models of devices in a medium-sized healthcare environment, right, that have hundreds of functions, and they're interacting with a number of applications that are medical device applications, or maybe just adjacent medical clinical applications that are not regulated, and also adjacent to regular commercial applications that are not regulated as well. And so the complications, right, of those ecosystems, of all that great variety in one ecosystem, is very difficult. Microsegmentation is one way to do it. Having devices that, while they can't have agents or can't have typical controls, if they did produce data that would allow folks to monitor their performance better, right, in a more native environment, if you will, right, would go a great way to increasing the transparency of what's on the network and allow organizations, both medical device manufacturers and healthcare organizations, to monitor the behavior of those devices while they're in the environment, shortening the time to detect and shortening the time required to respond and remediate.
Yeah, and then another thing too is when you think about kind of the shared responsibility, you think 5 to 10 years ago, were medical device manufacturers thinking of end of life and end of support, right? Oh, what about end of life or end of support of the operating system that was on that device? So as the medical device industry evolves, that is first and foremost on almost all new designs of products coming out, right? Are we selecting the right firmware operating systems that will last the 10 years of this device, that we can update, upgrade, and support these devices? So that is definitely has to be first and foremost.
I think that speaks also to the need for discovery and visibility of your inventory being a foundational element of cybersecurity. Someone mentioned that thousands of devices, but when you add up the medical devices, the building management systems, the HVAC, the energy systems, the elevators, and your traditional IoT cameras and IT, these risks can be coming from numerous sources inside the organization. So a system that can, A, identify your inventory, and then B, look at the whole product that composes that, SBOM, as a portion of that across those individual product components to identify where you may have affected code, you still need a system then to prioritize and look at exploitability, whether it's coming from CISA's actively exploitability list that might be helping with that, or the clinical risk of consequence. And I really like the comment I think Phil brought up around, you have to look beyond maybe even patient safety impact. The clinical operations may lead to a patient safety impact. And disruptions of other systems, be it communication systems, the ability to alert effectively, the ability to move patients within your facility, all these things can matter to time-sensitive patients that may have time-sensitive conditions, comorbidities that could be affected by a delay in care.
So one thing I think is that I'm picking up here as well too, when you think through how you're structuring a program, whether you're a device manufacturer or you're an HDO who's acquiring and managing these devices, and you're responsible for how these perform and what the security is, what the security risks really are. When you think through, I want to go back to something you said, Steve, which was patching. When you think through like what the patching cadence looks like for devices that are connected to the network, this is a totally different patching cycle and a totally different model than what you would think something around. Someone mentioned earlier, you can't really secure medical devices like endpoints on an IT network. This is a totally different model. Give me an idea of kind of like what this model would start to look like, knowing that we've sort of covered the microsegmentation component. We've covered sort of like where you would rank stack some of the risk. Why is this model so different than IT security?
Well, one of it is that lag time in the validation cycle. The manufacturers have not only their software that they're developing and their firmware, but they have to reside on these operating systems and have these third-party applications that go with it. So understanding the devices and models and the versions of each of those that could lead to vulnerabilities is really important. And I think, moving from understanding the components that could lead to a known vulnerability or correlate to a known vulnerability still lacks that risk perspective and exploitability perspective. And when you have 10,000 things that could be of risk, prioritization comes into play. So I think you can't do everything in one fell swoop, and there's that lag time. There's been a number of our customers that have looked at applying network policies as a way to try to mitigate that risk and look at what policies are important to apply to allow that clinical communication to not be disrupted. You don't want to shut down your PACS integration or your integration to Epic and so forth. So you need to know what policies are appropriate to apply, and then patch when it's available. And then when not, segment and look at these policies as a way to mitigate that. But I do applaud some of these vendors that have really moved towards remote updates of their devices and trying to get that patch cycle tuned to a quick turnaround time, particularly the IV pumps, because there's so many that just float around and they're hard to find and hard to get them all.
Yeah, so if I could jump on that, though, one of the problems of remote updating is the fact that the attackers take advantage of that, and you have to be very careful in your design of your update process, or otherwise, if you just set up a VPN, they might jump on that VPN and update it with malware. So you got to be very careful when you start. I think remote updating is the way to go, definitely, because of just so much easier. You don't have to have a person walking around every hospital and updating every machine on every floor, and you can do it all at one time. But I also think that you have to be very careful when you do. You have to really have a very carefully secure setup for remote updating.
And I think the real crux of the problem, right, is that cyber inserts an unpredictability that is thwarts normal maintenance operations, right? So devices are designed, they operate, after so many cycles, we know that things will fail, right? And so preventive maintenance programs, which are maintenance operations patches, are really designed to do that. Let's put something in place before the device fails, in a way. Cyber inserts that element of chaos in that unpredictability. We never know when a new vulnerability will pop up, when a bad actor will find a new way to exploit something or even weaponize a known vulnerability that is out there. And so that's really the challenge around this, right? So a couple of things really need to happen, I think, in order to do this. Manufacturers, particularly with their legacy devices, understanding what components are in there, and just as importantly, right, understanding if those components are exploited, what's the impact on the clinical functionality of the device, on the operations, right? And the other piece is they can be more transparent. There are a number of medical devices that are what I call patch at will, right? The manufacturers are like, just apply whatever Windows patches come out on Patch Tuesday, right? Healthcare organizations need to put that in as a data point so that they know they can patch these devices whenever they come out, right? Because there will not be an impact. The medical device is really, and the computer is really an accessory to the medical device itself, right? Then there's other devices that can't be patched, right? Because something can be broken. There's those devices that, and so those devices that never will be patched, right, have to also be known so that healthcare organizations can quit wasting precious resources trying to find out about those, right? And really focus on that portion of the devices that can be patched by the manufacturers. And then again, if the manufacturers can shorten that cycle from when we become aware of a vulnerability in a device and when that patch is available, so that the intersection of capacity and interest happens closer together, and we can really reduce, the effectiveness that these exploits have.
Which is really interesting, because if you think about, you mentioned, a few of you mentioned transparency already, right? And if you think through the composition of really any IoT device or any connected device today, but particularly within the medical device market, there's a lot of, there's third-party components in there. There's third-party and fourth-party software. In fact, there's one stat that suggests that out of any connected IoT device, any market, only 15% or so is first-party code. How do we sort of take this, what we've built so far, as some of the building blocks to managing risk in the medical device world, both for device manufacturers and for asset owners? How do we go about starting to think through what is going to really drive software transparency, firmware transparency? In obviously, the natural answer is the SBOM, but I think it'd be great for the audience today to kind of think through, how do we do that, and how do we start to really leverage the SBOM to do that?
Well, one thing is you have a ton of information. Even one software release, you've got so many components of an SBOM, and then multiply that by your devices, the system manager and the gateways, and then all the manufacturers and models. So it's going to be difficult to do on pen and paper. And the electronic file transfers, the Cyclone DX and SPDXs of the world can be, and the tools can be made available today that can begin to ingest that information and do the correlation and identify where affected code may reside. And I think it's really important, though, that SBOM isn't necessarily I don't mean to call it like a panacea. You really need to have that exploitability view and that risk view, as well as an assertion of vulnerability. Not everything that is correlated there is going to be exploitable. It may actually be, the operating system may be trimmed down to just its bare minimum, and some of those OS components may be irrelevant. But you need a tool that can aggregate that information, correlate it to your known connected medical device inventory, and help you make sense of it. It's just, you were dealing with a ton of information, and we need tools to help us with that.
Right. The SBOM is.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Peter.
Well, I was going to say, I think the other concern that you have is the fact that once you put all the software together, you may introduce vulnerabilities when you've gotten the integration of all those tools and how they interact and all that software interacts. So you really got to make sure that not only individual pieces are secure, but also because of the interaction of those, that may introduce vulnerabilities. right? And so I think you also have to have in there some type of process that also makes sure, okay, not just, okay, I got all this software and I'm just going to integrate it together and not do testing of it and evaluation of it, make sure it actually is secure and there are no vulnerabilities. And I think once you've even got delivery of that software, you got to make sure there's no vulnerabilities introduced through the integration process. Bill, I turn it over to you.
Sure, sure. And the SBOM, you know, as Steve said, isn't the panacea, right? It is just a data point, right? It really is. If we look at the MDS2, the Manufacturer Disclosure Statement for Medical Device Security, which first came out in 2004, and it's taken the industry years, you know, to share this in any sort of meaningful way. And it's really just a checklist of controls that are available on the devices. Right now, the SBOM is just a list of components that are in the devices. And as Peter said, not all of the components, and Steve said as well, not all of the components are exploitable, right? Because code has been hacked back, you know, components have been removed, components are turned off. Not every vulnerability has a kill chain, right, that can be exploited, right? And that's just as important, right? That's all part of this asset management piece, right? So the real key is we've got a number of specialty groups that are responsible for the ongoing operations of these devices, right? There's the clinical users, right, of the devices, the nurses, the technicians, the physicians, right, the surgeons. There's the IT group that has a number of specialties, whether it's the architects that determine how these devices, where they're placed in the environment. There's the, you know, authentication team that determines how people access them and what they can do when they get there, right? There's the update teams that keep them there. There's the desktop teams, and then there's the biomed teams. And even in biomed, there's specialties, right? There's folks that do nothing but diagnostic imaging or clinical lab or surgical instrumentation. So we've got all of these specialties, right? And all of these folks, and as Steve said earlier, facilities is now included too, because these devices are integrated more into our operational infrastructure within the facilities. So now we've got all these specialty groups. They've got all these different asset management systems, and they don't really talk to each other. They can't describe the same device across their environment. It's no different really than patient identification within a healthcare system, right? A hospital is more like a mall of specialty stores than it is a business as a whole, right? You've got cardiology and the OR and emergency department and ICU, and they all have their own special information systems for managing the patients that they are charged with, right? And so one of the most difficult things in healthcare is identifying the same patient in each and every one of those various departments. And this is, you know, the single patient record, right? It's created the challenge. Medical devices create the bulk of the information that ends up in the medical device records, right, for this. And so this is really the challenge, is getting people to correlate, right, what they know about their device and sharing it so that the entire enterprise has a holistic picture of what this device is. They understand if it fails, what's the impact on the patient, what's the impact on privacy, what's the impact on clinical operations, and they can better do this. If we look at the environment of care that healthcare operates under, right, they recognize that there's a network of specialties that manage the risk within the organization, right? IT should be integrated into that conversation so that we bring clinical delivery into the same risk conversation as we have IT risk and vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and that's a challenge for the or where we need to go, and with respect to governance too, as far as medical device manufacturers. What are we doing in our CI/CD cycles? Are we leveraging SAS, you know, static application security testing, SCA, software composition analysis? Do we follow it up with DAS, right, dynamic, to validate these products as we develop them? And then one of the other challenges, especially with large medical device manufacturers, we go all the way from a firmware level on a chipset to an application level facing you know, product on a cloud service too. So it is very diverse, you know, very challenging to manage, but some of the things we need to drive for.
Really interesting. I want to go back to one thing that we've covered to a certain extent, but there is a question that did come in from the audience, which is, I want to go back to patching for a second as we're talking through sort of like how we would start to do this, and then at some point in a little while we'll get into some of the particular issues around FDA draft guidance, EO 14028, and how that's been helpful. But for this question specifically, can the panel clarify about the position of needing device manufacturers to validate the patch before deploying on devices? This would delay time to get security patches from the OS on the devices. Does someone want to maybe take a first stab at that?
So I'll take a first stab at that because this is a hard question, right? And let's go back to the diversity of the technology that's called medical devices. You know, too often we're trying to solve this as if medical devices were chairs in a room and they all did the same thing and operated on the same infrastructure. And that's simply not the case. So we can't just say all devices should be validated, you know, by the manufacturer. As I alluded to before, there are devices that I used to call patch at will, right? These are devices that I didn't need any manufacturer validation for. It's the awareness of that. Manufacturers should be, and here's the thing I believe, is that they should be telling healthcare organizations, you can patch this whenever you want. You can wait for us to patch. Here's our normal patch cycle. You know, they can get better about setting expectations and managing those expectations, and just as importantly, delivering on those expectations. You know, the FDA had come out and said, oh, if it's a critical vulnerability, this should be resolved within 30 days, right? And Justin, you know, has enough experience in the business to know that that's really not practical because the development and test cycle just doesn't allow for that, right? But what would be helpful is if, you know, for Justin's product line, if he told his customers, you know, for this product line, you know, for vulnerable patches, we look to get them out in 4 months or 6 months, whatever the cycle is, right? And then when they come out, they're like, okay, that's the expectation. Then we manage to those expectations. And I think that's the piece that's missing, right? Is people make a lot of assumptions, or they're hoping for a lot of good things to happen, you know, and it's just not, you know, the reality. We're not sharing information well enough, right? And part of it is manufacturers don't know their equipment line as well as they could or should, because they've oftentimes acquired, inherited, bought, traded, sold, and so they don't have some of that root core knowledge. In other cases they do, and they have plans in place, you know, and they're perhaps reluctant to make statements that they would then have to commit to and deliver on, right? And I think we have to get to that point where we can make statements about quality, about patch cycles or maintenance cycles, and then deliver on those, just as we do with normal maintenance operations.
So as Phil said, it depends. Let me sum that up. Yeah, so yeah, definitely with the diversity of connected products that we have, especially with the acquisition of Hillrom recently, that we do have applications that are run on servers that are managed by the hospitals that can be patched, right? That's a disclosure. You can update that operating system on there. We have other ones where we're managing databases. Okay, we need a couple weeks, right, to do a verification and validation that those dependencies of that database won't be affected by the update on that server. And then we have other things that you know, may take much longer to do the verification validation, depending on the type of vulnerability we're trying to address. And then there's, you know, companies that make medical implants, and sometimes just to do a V&V cycle after their the code is addressed on there could take 60 days. So to try and take a broad brush approach is very, very difficult, depending on the type of device and how it could affect patient safety and performance.
That's an interesting point. I'll just be brief here, but we had a panel of CISOs recently discuss this issue, and one of the tools that they started to develop was a RACI, looking at the responsibility of who owns what for each of the major components, because you're talking about clinical engineering and the specialties that Phil pointed out, may own certain updates there, whereas operating systems and server level may be more of a network IT, and depending on the vulnerability, maybe it's maybe more hardening or other compensating controls. Segmentation might be more appropriate to address quickly. So this notion of ownership, the right ownership for the right problem, given the multidisciplinary nature of these systems, is a challenge, and having some type of methodology to approach that, RACI or otherwise, is something that some of our CISOs have been looking at recently.
Right. That's a great point, Steve. I'm glad you brought up the RACI. It's one of the tools that we leaned into heavily when I was back in healthcare industry, right? And we had a very large RACI, and we did it for every new acquisition, right? And so it changed, right? It's not the same thing just because I have, I belong to an organization that had more than 100 hospitals. We had, 5 different manufacturers of MRIs. And so the RACIs were different for each of those MRIs, right? Because we had capacities and competencies to support some because we had trained staff, and in others we didn't, right? Or we didn't have enough density of equipment in a geographic region to make it economical for us to support those. So we went through and did exactly that. And it wasn't just the traditional IT RACI and who's going to do, access and authentication, who's going to do patching, who's going to do network connectivity. We included the maintenance activities that went into that. Who's going to do traditional application updates, who's going to do, who's going to take the device out of service, right? Who's going to do preventive maintenance? So we had a very large RACI, and it was very, very advantageous, because then you knew when things were different, when something changed, when it grabbed your interest, you could look at the RACI and determine who's the resources I need to bring into this conversation, right? Who are the doers and who are the folks that have the information, so I know what to do and when to do it.
Absolutely, and some of those resources are external as well.
Exactly, great point.
Paid patches, so it's a complex environment, and the ownership is a complexity as well.
Right.
And it's interesting, we've started to kind of go down a path here where I think we're talking through some of the functional components and some of the functional considerations that go into constructing this strategy, so that it's, obviously there's going to be a continuous element to it, a continuous improvement element to this as well. But we're getting some really interesting questions from the audience here. So while we're on this, I'm going to ask one more question here, and then I think we'll move into some of the questions that we have around EO 14028 FDA draft guidance for a medical device. But here's the question that just came in: how do HDOs enforce standards for things like vendor remote support when device vendors are often building their own ecosystems to include that remote support? The comment is that this leads to fragmentation, and it could be difficult for the HDO teams, the InfoSec teams, the HDOs, to continuously keep things secure. Someone want to take a first stab at that?
Sure, that's really the crux of the problem, isn't it? Right? Manufacturers are building solutions that suit them and the technology that they're delivering, right? And I think rightly so to some degree, right? But what that creates is a great deal of variety in the infrastructure, that these devices then reside in. So this question is exactly right. It leads to fragmentation, and it's hard to manage. So the real key, right, is to have standards, right? Establish the standards that you want. And if a manufacturer is going to provide you with a solution, it has to meet your standards, right? And they should be working with ways that give you the tools that allow you to monitor those things. They cannot do it in a vacuum. They cannot do it and say, trust us, we're the manufacturer. From a clinical operations perspective, that's historically where we've been. From a patient safety perspective, that's historically where we've been. It doesn't really work for cybersecurity, right? So there's the trust but verify element that is necessary here, right? So if you're going to offer me a solution that is not my preferred solution, A, it has to meet my preferred solution requirements, and B, you are going to have to demonstrate that to me time and time again, so that I can be assured, with a reasonable amount of effort, right? Do not make my job harder than it needs to be. It's already very complex as it is.
So Phil, let me ask a question, but aren't you then talking about not just a healthcare organization standards, but really an industry set of standards? Because the vendors are never going to be able to keep up with, 100, 200 organizations having different requirements. So would the health ISAC be the one that would develop those standards?
So I think, Peter, folks say this a lot, right? We're all solving the same problem, right? Whether we pick, 62443, the industrial controls cyber standards, whether we pick 80,001, for those, or 14974 for managing the risks of these things. They're all different ways of stating the same thing. So I don't think that the different standards are the complication, right? A lot, knowing and being able to check that you're aligned to those are the same, but the solutions end up doing the same thing. It's much like, PCA, right? Where we've got controls in place, right, that protect, financial data exchanges, and those are technical controls that secure those risks in a knowable and measurable way, and that's really the key.
Yeah, and what Peter brought up earlier too about remote support and how that brings up new vulnerabilities, and you start to go back to what is the crux of when you develop a solution, right? It's a threat model. So as you work through clearances, approvals, and developing a threat model, sometimes it's very difficult to say, well, I'll use some open-ended solution that falls within these parameters, to be able to pull those together, because if that's that affects a device, that could be part of the attack surface. We have to get very detailed and descriptive on those, especially for devices that it could affect patient safety. So definitely a lot of areas we need to look at when we look at these remote solutions and try and consolidate those. But then also for manufacturers too, we also need to look at how can we maybe bring our different products together under one type of remote support, which makes it easier for the hospitals when we set up those either site-to-site VPNs or what have you, to do remote support and be able to let them be able to audit what we're doing. And the other thing is, are they always on? Or is it something we need to let them know, by the way, we're going to access this now for this amount of time?
And what might be an interesting thread here to start to delve into, Peter, you definitely have some strong opinions and perspectives based on some of the research you've also done around standards. And you sort of posed that question to Phil around the health ISAC. What if we said, well, shouldn't, we've got maybe the most, and I'd be interested in everybody's perspective on this, but maybe the most prescriptive, or at least a list that's sort of a checklist of specific things to do from the FDA in terms of their draft guidance around medical devices and cybersecurity, and making sure that you're checking those boxes off. Is the FDA that potential standards body specific to medical devices, or when you think through standards, do things like new vulnerabilities take standards and just push them out the door when we get the next, let's just say the next Log4j?
So I think, so first of all, so I worked for the government for a long time and did work some standards there. I think industry should drive the standards, not government should participate, but industry should drive the standards, I think. And I think because they're much more closer to the real what the problem is in terms of doing standards, and standards are only if everybody has a common problem and there's actually a solution. Like for example, all of telecom are based on standards, right? Everything, you wouldn't be able to use your mobile phone unless there's standards. And I think there's not that many standards in the security area. Should there be? Well, probably, but I'm not sure which ones they are, right? In terms of industry really needs to determine what that is. And I think that you know, I think we need to look at that issue of going to some additional standards, because for what, and I think you're starting to see a trend towards that. I think one of the problems is that not just in healthcare, but when you talk about cybersecurity in general, one of the problems that I see is that the lack of integration across tools. So every vendor has different security tools. And that security tool doesn't work exactly quite well with the next tool that you're using as you're trying to orchestrate your process of going through. I've identified a threat now, or identified a potential threat, trying to see whether or not it really is a threat. I'm trying to mitigate it, right? And the problem is that there's no standards in terms of, and I see what's happening now is that industry is going to sort of it's vendor standards in terms of, well, the big security companies are actually building their standards and tools to their tool set. And the CISOs, I'm hearing from CISOs saying that, boy, I just want to have, you know, one finger to point to every time something goes wrong. He's my guy. Maybe I have some additional tools, but I just want to go to one guy. And I think so. I think, and I think that's the start of going to standards. But you really don't want vendor standards. You want industry standards. Did that answer the question? I hope.
Yeah, that definitely, it was a great answer. And I'm just wondering if anybody else has anything else that they want to add to that. And if not, I'm prepared for the next question.
So I think, you know, really you have to go through an FDA. The recent draft of the pre-market guidance is a very good place to start, right? Because really it says the security objectives should be authentication, of authorization, availability, confidentiality, and secure and timely patchability and update ability of the devices, right? And so then they go back, and I really liked the way the FDA framed this as a quality issue, right? So what they're asking manufacturers to do is, can you develop and deliver and support these objectives on the medical devices that you're putting into the market, right? So they look at the risks that the device creates, right? Presents to the environment and to the users, right? So what's the intended use and the indications for use, right? What is the presence and the functionality of the data interfaces? So these are boundaries between components, and whether those components are internal to a device or components of the system that become the device ecosystem, or even the system of systems, which is what a healthcare organization is, right? And then what's the intended and actual environment of use? You know, what are the type of cybersecurity vulnerabilities present and the exploitability of them, right? So if they can be exploited, what's the impact on the functionality of the device, the availability, the confidentiality, right? And then what's the risk to patient harm of those? So because of the broad, you know, spectrum of technologies, right? This broad spectrum of clinical functionality and the underlying technology that supports that, right? If organizations go back to just that, what's the device designed to do, right? What can go wrong with that doing, right? And then what are the impacts of that going wrong, right? So then what are the risks that can force it to go wrong? And are there protections in place that we can either prevent the wrong from happening or recover from the wrong when it does happen? And those are, you know, if you break it down, it's highly complicated. I don't want to, people use the word complex, but that implies, you know, a lot of unknown interactions. But this is complicated. Break it down to small steps, solve the small steps to, you know, create the more secure picture as a whole.
Yeah, and when I look at standards from a medical device manufacturer's perspective, and also applications, you know, we're looking at ISO 27001 for maybe something we host, right? Processes PHI, PII, obviously following the NIST 800-53. There's an ISA 99 working group that you know, manages the 62443 standard. They're actually looking at taking that and layering on a medical device requirements. I know that's kind of been done by like a UL 2900 -1 and -2-1 specifically for medical devices, which aligns with FDA and pre and post market guidance documents. So there's a lot of standards to follow. It looks like there's some redundancies too. You obviously have high trust, which is geared toward medical specific information security management systems, but the 27001 gives you a little more flexibility if you're a mature organization that knows how to apply those requirements. So that's kind of what we look into, and just a subset of standards.
Really interesting. So I think one thing that I've heard pretty much from all panelists today, or at least almost a familiar word, is ecosystem, right? I think that there's some consistency around the ecosystem, and I know that at Finite State, one of the major questions that we get from a lot of our customers is, or at least one of the use cases that they have, is how do I secure and improve on a continuous basis, like the overall ecosystem? So on one side, maybe it's fair to not against each other, but like thinking through the device manufacturers and then the organizations who are acquiring and managing those devices that they're buying from the manufacturers. How do we start to get toward a more secure ecosystem between those two kind of like very diverse worlds that sort of helps kind of create more security from a third-party risk standpoint overall throughout the ecosystem?
I'd like to maybe jump in on that one and try to address Sivaram's question with dollar challenges of investment. We hear more and more about the importance of the CISO reporting to the board, making sure they've got KPIs that understand what material deficiencies I may have in place. Getting the board and executive buy-in to understand where you're currently at, and so that they can help with your investment, be it a new procurement of a device that may be going end of life, or investing in segmentation, visibility of these tools. It starts with a business case and identifying where you're currently at for your institution. So I think it's important to be able to communicate effectively as a CISO to the board, so that they understand the potential risk that they have as shareholders of their organization, and what that means ultimately down to their ability to deliver care effectively if it's not mitigated. So that would be a higher level view of that, but I think it's an important view so that you can help then put a plan in place to have more of an evergreen and protective strategy that would unfold underneath that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve. Does anybody else want to add to that particular question?
Well, and it's obviously a joint relationship too. For the HDOs to, hold medical device manufacturers accountable, right? Are you a mature organization? Are you doing the right things? Can you support your devices? Are you developing best in class devices that you're really driving cybersecurity into the full build, development and managing it? And then the last part is communication. That's a huge gap in the industry of when WannaCry came out, right? It was the hospitals calling 1,000 different device manufacturers saying, am I affected? And then eventually when they have to keep going through all these contact points, they look on somebody's website and say, oh, you have a product disclosure on there, security disclosure, and oh, it's been out there for a month. I didn't know about that, right? So I think really improving the communication to the right people at the organizations. And as Phil mentioned before, it almost should be a racy process, right? Because there are many people that should be informed that maybe aren't informed by the medical device manufacturers. And how do we drive that better and more efficient communication? And then aligning kind of with what FDA says, how do you measure that, right? The KPIs. How many vulnerabilities do you know about with your devices? How long did it take to develop a patch for the ones that were needed? And how many did you patch, right? And that's managing your fleets, as Steve mentioned earlier too, right? You could have, one type of device that has, 10 different versions out there because some have been updated, some haven't, and it's really managing that and communicating.
That's actually what brought Justin and I together, was around that visibility and proactive communication from the vendor using tools like Medigate to really show where that risk may lie within your organization and help with the decision support of what to do about it.
Right. And I think the other thing, and Steve brought up a good point, right, is being able to describe the state of the ecosystem to the board so that they have an understanding, right? But the other layer is the business units themselves, right? So more progressive healthcare organizations are finding ways to share with the business leaders, right? With the director of radiology, with the pathologists and the clinical lab directors and those folks that run the ICU and the other departments, that these are the risks that are present in your organization, that are present on the devices that you have, right? And they have those discussions about, from an operational perspective, which of these devices are, your crown jewels, which are necessary, right, to deliver the goods and services that your department is so, that your patient population is so dependent upon you to deliver, right? And then the clinical leaders, right, their business owners, I should say, have a better understanding of what risks are present, and they can balance the cyber risks with the benefits of clinical care delivery, right, and the business risks of these things. They can create backup plans, plan Bs, right? Healthcare, as I said before, they're very good about managing the risks that they are aware of. And so transparency is the key for this, right? And it's okay. Healthcare is a risk management business. It's what we do. If I go to a doctor and I present with symptoms, he looks at me as a patient, right? Considers what treatment options there are, considers which of those treatment options will deliver the best outcome with the least amount of harm, right? And that's what he would recommend or she would recommend for me, right? So that's risk management. And if we don't have this as an IT discussion just with the CISO, if we bring this conversation to those folks that are delivering the business end of healthcare, right, then they can make decisions. And then they can also have a plan B. They can determine, where should I make investments? Do I replace technologies? Do I let IT build in compensated controls to their infrastructure? Do they build in monitoring solutions so that they can detect earlier? There's a variety of solutions, none of them applicable across the spectrum of technology and across all the departments. So we have to do it, and kind of chip away at this, department by department, technology by technology, and make progress, because 80% of anything is better than 100% of nothing every single day, right? And so that's the approach that is necessary to really move forward. It's going to be incremental, until that manufacturer transformation happens and the next generation or the next 2 or 3 generations come out where these devices are built, security first, clinical functionality at a first or close second, right? And then we've got the kind of future secure environment that we really know that we need, right? But it's going to take a long while to get there.
If I could just jump on the initial comment that Steve made, I think one of the things about doing a risk assessment is to the CEOs and chairman of the boards understand dollars, and it's sometimes very hard to take a risk, a cyber risk, and turn it into a dollar value, and then present that to this CEO. And I think that's one of the challenges I think the healthcare industry needs to start thinking about and addressing, in terms of how do we really make it so that we can really easily quantify to our board to really understand what the risks are and what's the probability of that happening, those events happening, and what's the consequences.
Right. And I agree with you, Peter, 100%, right? Is we do have to do it, and we do have to put it in dollars and cents, because that's how we manage business, right? That's critical. The other element of that, right, is we have to have transparent horizon scanning, right? So we have to understand what are the risks that are present, and then we also have to be able to look forward and say, if I replace this technology, will it carry me into the future, or am I just making an incremental improvement, right? Am I buying more of the same, right? Because you don't want to invest scarce dollars and not really make forward progress.
Awesome. Thanks, Phil. Zach here again. Again, I would like to thank everyone within the Health ISAC membership for your attendance on today's event. It sounds like it went over rather well. Might have to have a round two, Tom, and bring everybody back for a second panelist presentation. Let me also give thanks to Finite State for putting this together and all of our panelists for presenting today. So if you had any questions out there that did not get answered, you can do one of two things. You can reach out to the Threat Operations Center at toc@hisac.org, and we'll relay the questions to Finite State. Or Tom, is there a channel in which they can get in contact with Finite State should they need to?
Sure. I think they can reach out at marketing@finitestate.io or sales@finitestate.io, and we can get any answers for you that you need.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Again, thank you to the members and thank you to the panel. Everybody, we wish you the best.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everybody.